Well, we're going to talk more about the situation in Ukraine now with Mark Temnycky, a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. Mark, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us on France 24. Here we are with Ukraine saying it's ready to take Russia up on its offer to hold these direct talks in Istanbul Thursday, but only if Moscow confirms a full and lasting ceasefire today. How likely is that to happen, do you think? Will Moscow accept?
Thank you again for having me. And unfortunately not. Reuters and Newsweek reported this morning that there was another drone strike launched by the Russians on Ukraine, just indicating further that Putin is totally disinterested in having this ceasefire agreement. Most recently, this ceasefire has been discussed since January when President Trump came in to lead the United States. European leaders are also meeting with President Zelensky, as well as President Trump and his team are meeting with the Russians to try to come up with some ceasefire. So this has been going on now for 4 months. Most recently, President Putin proposed a ceasefire during the Easter holiday weekend. But even after that announcement, the Russians launched further drone strikes on Ukraine, indicating further that Putin is completely disinterested in having a ceasefire.
Indeed. So where does that leave U.S. President Donald Trump, who had done a lot of outreach, if you like, to Moscow, as something that had gone hand in hand with what other people saw as U.S. pressure on Ukraine to accept this peace deal on terms that would actually reward Vladimir Putin?
Several European leaders came to Ukraine over the weekend, and they said that if a ceasefire is not reached, that they will push further sanctions on the Russian Federation to try to force it into war. I think it would be very important for the United States to support such a platform as well, where they have seen that they've been trying to meet with the Russians for 4 months. And if this ceasefire negotiation is not going anywhere, putting additional pressures on Putin to stop this war is the only way that the war will end. President Zelensky has said on numerous occasions he's open to a ceasefire. He even, as the program showed recently, he's ready to speak with President Putin this week in Turkey. And President Putin keeps dismissing these agreements and possibilities to try to end the war. So I think that the United States should work with the European allies to try to come up with new sanctions and other ways to put additional pressures on Russia to end its war. Because the ceasefire agreement, unfortunately, after 4 months, still has not reached a deal.
Indeed. And Mark, you just mentioned there the Europeans. It seems at least the vast majority of EU members don't see quite eye to eye with Donald Trump at the moment. I mean, you mentioned sanctions, but what more can Europe do in the event that Putin does reject this 30-day ceasefire, as seems likely?
I think in addition to maintaining sanctions to weaken the Russian economy, which for our listeners, if Russia has a weak economy, it can't purchase the weapons it needs for its war and continue waging its war. The Europeans should continue providing Ukraine with the defense weapons it needs to protect itself from Russia's ongoing war. And that was a condition that President Putin said he's open to a ceasefire if the West stops sending aid to Ukraine. Well, if Ukraine no longer has defense capabilities, Russia will just go in and invade again and advance further in its unnecessary war. So by providing Ukraine with the military assistance it needs, it will be able to protect itself as well as its citizens from Russia's continued aggression.
Mark, do we have any sense, you're mentioning citizens, do we have any sense how Russian citizens themselves feel about this eventual ceasefire deal 3 years into this war?
It's difficult to get that opinion because a lot of the opinion polling as well as the news outlets within Russia are controlled by the Russian government. Based on current statistics and other platforms, they show that the majority, so 60+% of Russian citizens are still very supportive of the war. They want the war to continue. They are not open to a ceasefire. But again, it's very difficult to understand how truthful those accounts and statistics are because of the Russian government control over all those polling stations as well as news outlets.
Mark, thank you for that. We'll leave it there. That's Mark Temnycky, a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. Thanks for speaking to me live there from New Jersey.
Thank you again.